Russian money now works against the Russian army. Frozen Russian assets in the West, billions of dollars and euros, are being directed toward weapons and ammunition for Ukraine. Putin's worst nightmare is coming true.
I will support any path that allows the use of Russian resources to continue helping Ukraine.
Putin will pay for his war.
The nations of the European Union are preparing to use frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. The amount is enormous, 140 billion euros. How many years of defense and resistance to Russian aggression could this fund sustain? When will the EU make what is, without exaggeration, a historic decision? And why could this step push Putin to end the war sooner than expected? Watch in the special report, Unfreezing the Assets, how the West uses Russia's money to strengthen Ukraine's defense. In February 2022, Putin made a grave miscalculation.
I've made the decision.
The magnitude of that mistake could be seen on the faces of his top bankers.
The decision to launch a special military operation.
The head of Russia's central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, was stunned by the announcement. She knew very well that Russia kept enormous reserves in Western countries, about $300 billion. Starting a war of aggression and invading a neighboring state would mean losing access to all of it. Putin miscalculated. He was wrong in every possible way. The Kremlin dictator expected to capture Kyiv in 3 days. He believed Europe and the United States would hesitate and stay out of the conflict. Instead, he met heroic resistance from the Ukrainian people, a drawn-out war, and harsh Western sanctions. First of all, the freezing of Russia's sovereign assets. In the first days after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the G7 states froze Russian assets. This happened almost simultaneously in many countries. The largest share of the Russian central bank's reserves is in Belgium, 210 billion euros. France holds 19 billion. Assets are also located in Luxembourg, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and Japan. Precise numbers are not always disclosed, but globally around $300 billion in Russian assets are blocked. They are held in different currencies and bonds. Russia cannot access them or sell them. They remain frozen because Moscow violated international law. The Kremlin protested, saying these were sovereign assets and should be untouchable. But in March 2022, the leaders of the G7 saw Russia bombing Mariupol, destroying entire districts and killing tens of thousands of people. They saw the atrocities in Bucha and Irpin, the brutality of the Russian army, the scale of the war Putin unleashed, which resembled the Second World War. The countries that froze Russia's assets had no doubt the Kremlin must not regain access to this money until it ends the war and pays compensation. But Putin kept destroying Ukrainian cities and terrorizing civilians. Western countries took the next step. In 2024, they began transferring the income generated by frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. The assets themselves were not touched, but all $300 billion do not sit idle. Russia has no access to them, but the funds still generate income. Like a regular bank deposit, the interest continues to accumulate, and these interest payments are transferred to Ukraine. The United States acted first, sending Kyiv $1 billion backed by income from frozen Russian assets at the end of 2024. Canada followed with $1.7 billion. Then the European Union joined. EU countries have already provided nearly $16 billion to Ukraine. And this is only the beginning. Income continues to accumulate. The G7 states agreed that Ukraine will receive $50 billion this way over several years. The funds will go primarily to defense. The losses that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine are estimated at an astronomical $524 billion. These are the calculations of the World Bank and the United Nations. The destruction grows every day with each new missile or drone strike. The losses already far exceed the value of all frozen Russian assets. Confiscating Russia's money would be the most logical and fair step. Ukraine has been calling for it since the start of the invasion, joined by many Western politicians. For example, the chairs of foreign affairs committees and members of the European Parliament from 19 countries proposed last year that the G7 stop using half measures and confiscate all frozen assets of the Russian central bank, all 300 billion, and direct them to strengthen Ukraine's defense. But the G7 leaders do not want to use direct confiscation. They offer a different mechanism. Proposed by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, it is called a reparations credit.
If we all agree that Ukraine is our first line of defense, we have to step up the military support for Ukraine. This is the reason why today we are disbursing 4 billion euros for Ukraine. 2 billion euros of that will be invested.
Here is how this mechanism works. Russian assets in Europe were held in the form of securities. Many of these securities have matured. They turned into money sitting in accounts. These funds will be used to provide Ukraine with a credit of 140 billion euros. The credit will be interest-free.
The loan would not be disbursed in one go, but in tranches and with conditions attached. And we will strengthen our own defense industry by ensuring that part of the loan is used for procurement in Europe and with Europe.
This means Russia must reimburse Ukraine for the damage it caused, and this amount is far larger than the 140 billion euro reparations credit, many times larger. If Russia compensates the damage, meaning it pays reparations, Ukraine will return 140 billion euros to Western countries, and Western countries in turn will transfer these funds to Russia. If Moscow refuses to pay reparations, which under Putin is very likely, Kiev is not obligated to return anything. In that case, Russia will not recover its frozen assets. Putin will keep complaining, calling it confiscation.
Theft, robbery.
But where is the confiscation? Pay for the destruction, the deaths, and the injuries you caused, then you will receive your money back. The idea of a reparations credit for Ukraine already has the support of Germany's Federal Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Like the head of the European Commission, he insists that Ukraine should receive a 140 billion euro credit using frozen Russian assets.
I will support any path that allows the use of Russian resources to further assist Ukraine and ensure the quickest possible end to this war. There is a very strong consensus on this within the European Union and the European political community. Putin should not underestimate our determination.
The German finance minister says the same.
Putin will pay for his war. We will make sure of it. This is not about taking Russia's money for ourselves. These funds allow us to generate a credit for Ukraine. We want to support Ukraine in the fight it must wage against Russian aggression.
European leaders insist that this credit must be used primarily for weapons and ammunition for Ukraine. The president of Ukraine supports this.
Ukraine sees three main packages for the use of these funds, if we are talking about weapons, because we would also like to direct some of the money to social needs for our people. But first of all, weapons. The first package is weapons produced in Ukraine. The second is European weapons that Ukraine does not manufacture. And the third is American weapons that neither Ukraine nor Europe produces. Air defense systems come first.
Most European countries support the reparations credit for Ukraine. For example, Poland's leaders.
Enough talk. It's time for action. Let's finance our aid to Ukraine using frozen Russian assets.
The leader of Denmark shares this view.
Idea of using the frozen assets, I think, is a good idea.
The same position is held by Sweden, Finland, and the Baltic states.
We have been asking for quite a long time to use those immobilized assets.
Ukraine needs more in weaponry, assistance, and money, and also we should use Russian frozen assets as much as possible for that.
Only a few European Union states still express concerns about the reparations credit for Ukraine, including Belgium. This country holds the largest share of frozen Russian assets in Europe, around 180 billion euros. They are kept in this institution, the Euroclear Central Securities Depository. Belgium is not opposed to using this money to fund Ukraine, but the government has conditions. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever presented them to EU leaders. The most important, the transfer of money to Ukraine must not be interpreted as confiscation of Russian assets. He fears lawsuits from Russia. In addition, EU countries must share all risks with Belgium when these funds are used for Ukraine.
No problem, but I want answers on every question I asked. I want a maximum of legal certainty, I want solidarity, and I want transparency.
European leaders heard de Wever. They began consultations on how to meet Belgium's conditions and design the best legal mechanism for using the frozen Russian assets. The issue was discussed at the Brussels summit on October 23rd and 24th.
We have three demands. I want a full mutualization of the risk, because there is a big risk. We will suffer from enormous claims. So if we want to do this, we will have to do this all together. We want guarantees, if the money has to be paid back, that every member state will chip in. The consequences cannot only be for Belgium. And the third demand is that every country who has...
European leaders are looking for a solution to meet Belgium's conditions and share the risks.
Belgium fears that all responsibility will fall on it, but we are ready to create a mechanism of shared European responsibility.
Yes, the worries are about the solidarity regarding the risks, and everybody agrees that no country should bear the risks or this burden alone. So if we need to come up with a mechanism to make sure that this is the case and Belgium gets the security that they need.
We take very seriously concerns from Belgium, and the solution must be it must be legally visible.
And this decision could already be made on December 18th at the next summit of EU leaders.
We have to work in a way that we have a solution before Christmas Eve, so we are able to ensure that we can finance Ukraine for the next years. I know some colleagues find this way forward more difficult than I do, and we have to solve the problems, but I also have to say, what is the alternative? The alternative is not to let Russia win this war.
But regardless of whether a decision is made at the next EU summit, funding for Ukraine will continue, if not through frozen Russian assets, then through EU member states' own resources. European leaders committed to covering Ukraine's financial needs for 2026 and 2027.
Russia should take good note of this. Ukraine will have the financial resources it needs to defend itself against Russia's aggression and in the foreseeable future. Now, the technical, legal, and financial aspects.
But using the frozen Russian money specifically for Ukraine's defense would be the best step. And this would be the right signal for other countries. Do not start wars of conquest. Do not try to occupy territory that is not yours. It will inevitably bring consequences for you, including the loss of access to your assets abroad.
If you don't start the war against another country, then you're out of the risk. And I think majority of the countries, majority of the people, majority of the companies in the world will not start wars again.
By launching a war of aggression, Russia cannot demand that its money and securities abroad remain untouched. It is like a murderer in court, invoking the right to freedom of movement, and on that basis, demanding not to be sent to prison. Nonsense. Russia violated a fundamental norm of international law. It kills tens of thousands of innocent people. It is trying to destroy an entire state. That is why its assets abroad are frozen. The countries holding these funds were obligated to freeze them. And Russia must be held accountable and compensate Ukraine for the damage. This obligation has far greater legal weight than the principle of asset inviolability. In 2022, the United Nations recognized that Russia bears responsibility for aggression against Ukraine and must compensate all the losses it caused. This is an official document, and it will be a decisive argument in favor of using Russia's assets.
International law operates as a comprehensive system, and within this system, there is not only a prohibition on aggressive war, but also an established obligation for states that violate international law to provide compensation for the losses they cause. This is why focusing solely on the claim that the immunity of state property or state assets prevails over all other norms of international law is incorrect, because such a view overlooks the broader system in which these rules exist and interact.
Experts in international law are confident that the risk of lawsuits from Russia demanding the return of frozen assets is close to zero. The funds have been frozen for more than 3 years, and during this time, the Putin regime has not appealed to any international court to challenge their blocking.
The Russian Federation has no court to which it can turn and demand these funds from the Belgian government. If such a court existed, the Russian Federation would already have initiated this process, because a freeze can also be viewed as a violation of the immunity of state assets, not only their transfer. But the Russian Federation is not taking any legal action at the moment.
There is no prospect of winning in court. International institutions are independent and incorruptible.
The Russian Federation can appeal the decision to transfer the funds to Ukraine in the Belgian National Court. The Belgian National Court, in turn, can refer the case to the Court of Justice of the European Union, so that the EU court can assess whether the actions of the Belgian government comply with European Union law. However, the level of rule of law in both the Belgian court and the Court of Justice of the European Union is so consistently high that there is almost no doubt that these judicial bodies will issue a decision in favor of the Belgian government.
A decision to direct Russian money to Ukraine for weapons, air defense, and military support will speed up the end of the war. It will confront Putin with a fact he cannot ignore. He will not win. There is no alternative but negotiations. Yet he still lives in an illusion. His subordinates present him with false data and maps showing imaginary advances of his army. He believes Ukraine's defenses are on the verge of collapse.
We will crush them.
There is no basis for this belief. Russia is simply killing its own army, paying with hundreds of thousands of lives for minimal gains. But once Kyiv receives $140 billion for defense, even Putin will understand that pushing further is impossible. Ukraine will have a guaranteed source of military funding for years to come, says France's foreign minister.
Ukraine will be able to defend itself for at least 3 years thanks to the credit provided by the European Commission, which will later be repaid through Russian reparations.
Russia faces a rapid economic collapse. Putin bet everything on a war of attrition. Instead, he will get the opposite. Ukraine's defense budget will grow, while Russia's will shrink. Russia can no longer sustain its army at previous levels. A paradox has emerged. Putin must keep paying the Russian military large sums for signing contracts, and weeks later, pay death benefits to the families of those same soldiers. He must pour billions into production of drones and armored vehicles. And at the same time, he will indirectly fund the Ukrainian armed forces, Because the reparations credit will finance Ukraine's defense. This has never happened in history. A dictator funding both his own army and the army of the state he seeks to destroy.
Putin's image may start to crumble. Caricatures will appear, people will laugh. This is a powerful tool of pressure on the Kremlin elite.
This entire structure is complicated and difficult. The sooner Russia signs a peace agreement, the less of its own money will be spent against its own army. Every additional day of the war will work against Putin. Time itself will work against him. Any idea of a war of attrition is something the dictator will have to abandon.
When the frozen money is eventually used to purchase weapons for Ukraine, it becomes possible to develop a kind of conditioned reflex. And just like Pavlov's dog, Putin needs to be trained to develop this reflex so that he understands that war is harmful and that it must be brought to an end. Gradually, he will realize that he is financing his own defeat because he is enabling the Ukrainian armed forces to strengthen themselves. And he is doing it with his own money.
Previously, most financial aid came from the United States. Now the U.S. is no longer providing weapons for free to the same extent. It sells them to European countries, which then transfer them to Ukraine.
We're going to be sending them weapons and they're going to be paying for them. The United States will not be having any payment made.
Ukraine is now the only barrier stopping Putin from launching a ground invasion into EU countries. When EU leaders approve the reparations credit for Ukraine, Russia will pay for its own war.
So that this money does not come from taxpayers' pockets, but from bonds backed by future reparations or frozen assets that will be seized if Russia refuses to pay.
Russian jets and drones violate EU airspace. Russia carries out sabotage in Europe and builds military bases on its borders. The risk of a Russian ground invasion into EU territory grows daily. EU states are already preparing not for hybrid war, but for open conflict. For leaders of states that could be hit first, such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, even asking whether the aggressor's money should be used for defense sounds absurd. It must be done immediately. This is what a Lithuanian member of the European Parliament says.
This is a question of survival and the security of the European Union itself. In the end, the immunity of an aggressor state cannot outweigh the question of whether we survive at all. Nearly 200 billion should be put to work for our defense, because Ukraine's defense must be seen as our defense. This is a very effective tool for resisting Russia and preventing its victory.
Funds from the reparations credit for Kiev will also go toward weapons production at European defense enterprises. This will strengthen not only Ukraine, but also the European Union.
We need to use any kind of Russian money for Ukrainian production and increase it. It's cheaper and quicker. And we speak, first of all, about long range. It's about drones. It's about electronic warfare, systems of electronic warfare, and it's about missiles. We have one.
To produce these weapons, funding is necessary. Any delay in the decision to use Russian assets carries enormous risks. If Russia attacks the EU, all these frozen billions sitting in accounts will no longer help.
Europe understands that security threats are extremely costly. It is better to solve the problem at a distance than later, when it becomes necessary to send your own soldiers and carry out mobilization. The losses for Europe would be colossal, measured in trillions of euros. For Europe, this is also an existential challenge. If Europe cannot solve the problem of supporting Ukraine and protecting itself, preventing Putin from moving further, then Europe will simply collapse.
Meanwhile, Putin continues destroying Ukrainian cities and killing tens of thousands of men, women, and children. 7-year-old Makar Dorosh was killed in Zaporizhia on October 10th this year during a massive Russian strike. His father, who had recently returned from Russian captivity, ended up in intensive care. Makar's 2 sisters and his mother, who were also in the house, survived by miracle.
My older one helped me break the window. She jumped out first. I heard my husband shouting. I ran around the house. Everything was already burning. Where the child was, that was the worst part. An ambulance took my husband, but by the time they reached my son, I understood he was gone.
No amount of money will bring this woman her son back, but she has a husband in critical condition and 2 daughters, and nothing else. Their home is destroyed. There have been thousands of similar tragedies in more than 3 years of full-scale war. Last year, the Register of Damages for Ukraine began operating, an international database documenting harm caused by Russia. It already contains 60,000 claims, but over time there will be far more. People need support. Russia must pay for this. On October 1st this year, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe unanimously supported a draft convention to create an international claims commission for Ukraine to secure compensation for losses caused by Russian aggression.
Not a single amendment was submitted by colleagues. Everyone agrees. There is full consensus that Russia must pay reparations to Ukraine. And we urge people to file claims now, not later, to legitimize this platform. So that PACE and the Council of Europe see. We already have 100,000 claims. Let us move toward frozen assets.
So the decision on the reparations credit for Ukraine, meaning the allocation of money for the country's defense, will only be an intermediate step, just the beginning. After that, Ukraine will seek the full transfer of Russian assets to compensate everyone harmed by Putin's aggression. And when Russian money, which Putin considers his own, begins working at full strength to reinforce Ukraine, then the dictator will understand that his so-called special military operation, or as many in Russia now call it, his strange military operation, has gone completely off course, that each new day of war brings his collapse closer. As long as this war continues, the aggressor's assets will work against him, and afterward, they will be used to compensate everyone who suffered from his aggression. Today, more than $300 billion in frozen Russian assets represent a historic opportunity to prove that international law functions. And across the entire civilized world, one conclusion is now firmly taking hold. Transferring these funds to Ukraine is not only lawful, it is genuinely just. Maxim Urlapov, Special Report.